Begin, I would like to acknowledge our beautiful country. So you join us today from all over Australia, and we actually have Jen joining us from Canada as well, so a big welcome to her. And you join us from many different workplaces and homes. And I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people where I live and make my home, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, of the Kulin Nation and the traditional owners and lands and waters around Australia from where you join us today. And of course, I commit to remain humble, to tread softly on the land, and to continually learn. What are we going to cover today? Obviously, all of us, when we are recruiting, have the need to ensure that there's a lot of diversity in the mix. There's a huge focus on gender, of course, and there's a huge focus on a whole lot of the different characteristics that we're supposed to be looking at. Ageism is something that's becoming definitely more prevalent and more talked about. And I'm going to share with you in the follow-up resources a fantastic article in Forbes saying that ageism and ableism are the two things that we need to be looking at going forward. So Indeed have done a fantastic report on this. They did a survey, and we have invited them on today to talk a bit about that survey. Now, we know that 62% of us need to hide our identities at work. And interestingly, one of my son's 13-year-old friends is identifying as female and has changed her name to Taylor, and we've just spent 3 days with her. I spent the whole time getting everything wrong and apologising. It's becoming more and more common, and the acceptance that my son and his friends have made towards Taylor is amazing. And I look at her and think her identity is going to be able to be accepted in the workplace a lot more than it probably is now. So I'm going to call Erin to the stage. So Erin, just turn your camera and mic on. Erin is Indeed's Recruitment Evangelist, and she's going to lead a discussion with us on how we make small changes to our everyday processes and how to make a big impact on D&I. So there's going to be a short presentation, and then we're going to move into a workshop. Each of our sponsors of Tribe, being Indeed, N-Border, Smart Recruiters, Noble Agency, fantastic employment brand agency, and People Scout, are on tables to help you with their discussions, and I'll be calling on them to give me some of their thoughts as well. So Erin, my love, if you would like to make a start, I will hand over to you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. I'll just share my screen, and I'm hoping everyone will be able to see it. So if someone can give me a heads up in the comment, a thumbs up, or let me know if you can see my screen, we will be off and running. So I should have just shared it. Is everyone able to see my screen? If anyone wants to just pop into the chat box. Not yet. Okay, let me try this one more time. That's okay. That's okay. Chrome tab. Here we go. Oh, see it now. Hopefully everybody can.
Now, thanks.
Yeah. Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for all of these wonderful thumbs up in the chat. I'm really excited to be here because this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, as is most. And I just wanted to start by talking about, first of all, Andrea did a great introduction to the D&I DIMB report that we just did, and go through some of those findings and why we did it in the first place. But for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Erin Waddell, and I'm the Recruitment Evangelist for the Insight Strategist at Indeed. I help our clients, partners, and employers understand how they can better optimize their campaigns on our platform or take their partnership with us further. And I'm also, and I'm very proud of this fact, one of the founders and co-chairs of the employee resource group called Access Indeed, which is for visible and invisible disabilities. And I think the other thing I was going to say is I know I'm a very American, I have a very American accent. I'm actually celebrating my 10-year anniversary of moving to Sydney next month, which is pretty crazy. I did not plan on being here that long, and here I am. So it's my honor to be here with you today. So uh, I wanted to also explain why I'm so passionate about diversity and inclusion. And if you haven't met me in person, then you probably wouldn't be able to tell from me sitting here that I actually was born without my lower left arm. I was, they don't know why, they don't know what happened, but I was born without my lower left arm. 6 months old, I was given a prosthetic arm. It didn't move, it didn't do anything. It looked like a doll. It looked like I was wearing a doll hand, but technology has progressed, and now every day I wear a robotic prosthetic. It is not connected internally, in case anybody's wondering, but I wear a prosthetic arm, which helps me in my day. Something that's second nature to me. It's a really cool piece of technology, and I'm always pretty happy to talk about it if you have questions. But I'm a very proud disabled woman, and I feel like a lot of the topics that I'm talking about these days that come with hiring diverse talent comes back to the experiences people have and making sure that people understand, hiring managers, recruiters, everybody that's in this space understands what kind of experiences that people in marginalized groups have. So, I can change the slide here. The first thing we want to talk about, and I went a little too far, sorry, is that diverse teams can help you become a better business. And recent research has and continues to show that companies with a diverse workforce are more likely to excel. A global McKinsey study of more than 1,000 large companies across 15 countries found that employers with a diverse workforce are more likely to have above average financial returns. That's 36% more likely for companies with higher levels of racial and ethnic diversity, and 25% more likely for companies with higher levels of gender diversity. Of course, the reverse was true for those that ignored diversity. So companies with low levels of both gender and ethnic diversity were 27% more likely to underperform on profitability than all other companies in the data set. The big question is, how do we tap into this talent and add more value to our businesses and our companies? Well, indeed, we wanted to understand that a little better, and we wanted to understand the state of diversity and inclusion and belonging in Australia. And when we took a look out there, we couldn't really find what we wanted to find. So we undertook one of the most comprehensive surveys in this space ever conducted in Australia earlier this year, and published the report, Smoke and Mirrors, the State of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging in Australian Workplaces last month. Now, I'm going to take you through some of the top line results that we found, but I'm also going to give you an opportunity to download this report at the end of this presentation. So you will be able to download this if you already haven't at the end of my presentation. So before we go through that, I just wanted to take a moment to outline how we define diversity, inclusion, and belonging here at Indeed. So the way that we define diversity is representation in hiring in a way so your organization reflects the global communities in which you operate. Inclusion is the actions and behaviors taken to create a culture in which employees feel valued, trusted, and able to be their authentic selves when they show up at work. Belonging is that feeling of community with the people and environments that make everyone feel connected. And the other thing I wanted to talk about today, and I don't feel like it's touched on as much, is intersectionality. And it's a little more complex, but it's the cumulative way where multiple forms of diversity combine, overlap, and intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals and groups. Now, when we asked Australian workers what diversity and inclusion meant to them, 66% of people said that it means to treat everyone equally. I don't know if that's how I would define it, and I'm not sure if that's how you would define it, but that's what our participants of the survey and the study said. The remainder of participants thought that it meant things such as being politically correct, or, and this one kind of made me cringe, filling quotas. That's a really hot topic in terms of whether people have diversity quotas or not. And I wanted to stop there and tell a little bit a story for you about myself. My previous career before working at Indeed in marketing, back when I was in America, I was a mechanical engineer. I worked in a profoundly male-dominated space. And when I first showed up to my first role, my first job as an engineer, I worked at Boeing, working on satellites. I went to a event for young people, like young engineers, to get to know each other. And someone came up to me and said, "Oh, well, you're a woman and you're disabled. Well, you just ticked all the diversity boxes, and that's why you got hired." I was 22. This was my first job, and I it changed the outlook that I had on myself, on my career, and on the way that I applied to jobs forever. Because I never wanted to be that person getting a job because I was the diversity hire. And I know a lot of people that have been in that same position. And I know a lot of people that also feel that it completely undermines their abilities as an employee. It undermines any intelligence they have because they get boiled down to boxes that they tick in an application to an employer. And so this one really hit me hard because I don't want people to think that diversity means filling quotas. I mean, it is important that we make sure that we have a robust and diverse workforce, but if it comes down to taking somebody on just because they fall into one of these groups, then we're actually not doing our business any favors. So the good news in all of this is that almost 3/4 of people believe that everyone in their workplace is actually treated equally. These statistics seem reasonably good at a first glance, but when we think more about this, being treated equally isn't always necessarily what diverse candidates need in terms of support. And of course, it comes down to the points of, equality versus equity here. Is treating those who are disadvantaged or traditionally challenged by or discriminated against the same as everyone else the way to approach diversity and inclusion? And is it how we appropriately support those individuals? Or do we need to have and be aware of and competent in understanding that disadvantage and those challenges so that we can provide the support to elevate them to that baseline level comparable to others in the organization? And do these statistics highlight the role that we have as employers and our organizations to educate our employees more on what diversity and inclusion actually means? So when we took a look at this, we found that only 60% of people say that their workplace employs a workforce of people from diverse groups. So they feel like everyone's being treated equally, but there's only 60%. And I mean, that's not too bad of a number that's saying that their workplace employs a workforce of people from diverse groups. The other thing we took a look at, and we really can't ignore, is that the past year and a half has presented fairly unique challenges as well. So we also layered in what impacts, types of impacts COVID-19 has had on DI&B in the workplace as well. We asked people whether they thought companies had become worse at promoting D&I, and 1 in 4 LGBTIQ plus employees thought so. 1 in 5 workers with a disability agree, and 1 in 5 Indigenous employees also agree with that statement. That they thought that during the pandemic, the employers were getting worse at promoting DI&B. And another important concept we looked at in our survey was the experiences that employees had being their true, authentic selves in the workplace. This is an important one, especially nowadays. And Andrea touched on a really important topic about being able to be your authentic self. It can be hard enough just in your daily life, but when you show up in a workplace, that can also have unique challenges. A shocking amount of people feel unsafe or at risk in being their authentic self at work. And as a result, hide a part of their identity when they are at work. 62%, that's almost 2/3 of workers. When we drilled down into different groupings, we found themes of discomfort in highlighting challenges that they are facing. Some feel that they are putting themselves in danger of bullying and harassment. I think we hear this all too often. Others feel as though they have to laugh along at offensive jokes told about their marginalized group I have seen this myself in workplaces since the beginning of my professional career. I'm sure others have as well. And just to hear people come out and say that, I think made that a little more real to me in terms of something that I think is something people might not be aware of, is that those offensive jokes, if you're cracking at the expense of another person, they probably are offended, but they're not comfortable in standing up for themselves because it could become worse for them as well. And I thought this was a really interesting slide in terms of which people were feeling that they couldn't be their authentic selves at work. This is LaFawn Davis, who is our Group Vice President of Environmental, Social, and Governance at Indeed, under which our DI&D initiatives fall. She says, you can spend millions on hiring a more diverse workforce. They will walk in and right out the door about a year and a half later, because if you don't focus on creating an inclusive environment in which they can thrive, why would they stay? And that's a great point. And so last month, we actually announced that we were going to take on a new initiative of committing to help 30 million job seekers who face barriers find employment by 2030. And Indeed has taken a lot of initiatives to make sure that in this space of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace, we are doing as much as we can to make sure that not only our workplace is as inclusive as possible, but also that our products are inclusive and that we are trying to help and give job seekers as many opportunities as we possibly can. And so a couple things that we do at our company is that we ensure that our website meets web accessibility standards to make sure that it is accessible for anyone and everyone that might have challenges on websites to make that accessible for them. We offer free training to all employees on topics such as unconscious bias, allyship, and neurodiversity. We receive regular emails from our senior leadership on issues of D&I and encouragement of pronoun use. We also, as we just saw, have a senior leadership employee who has DI&B as a huge part of her remit, so that it's constantly being brought up at that senior level. One of the most important elements of our DI&B efforts at Indeed are our inclusion resource groups. We call them inclusion resource groups, but they can be called employee resource groups, business resource groups, ERG, BRG. We actually have 10 in total. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I was responsible for starting up the Access Indeed group. And I started that up in 2017, and it's grown from about 2 people in 2017 to now over 800 people globally. I'm very proud of how far it's come in a short amount of time. And one of the questions I get asked the most often is how. How do we start up an inclusion resource group when we have no resources, we have no budget to put towards it? And that's a great question, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides from now. But this is the inclusion resource groups that we have here. And one thing that we focus on really heavily at Indeed is the intersectionality piece. We are always trying to figure out if there are multiple groups here that can work together to come to a common conclusion or solve a problem that can help more than one. And so I want to bring you back to the question, how do we tap into this talent and add more value to our businesses? And so I wanted to go over some key recommendations that will hopefully give you a starting point for either starting these conversations or helping you along your journey to hit these goals in attracting and retaining diverse talent. These will also be the topics for discussion in our breakout rooms, and you can pick the topics that you want to discuss, or Andrea will explain how that'll work when I'm done. But the first thing we're going to talk about is language. And when I say language, I'm really talking about business-specific language. Sometimes we call that jargon. That can be alienating, especially to young workers. This really starts in your job ads. This can be in your job ads, your job titles, your job descriptions. It can be in your company, your branding, your EVP, anything that you're putting out there. There was a study done of around 2,000 recent graduates that found that 70% of young people can be discouraged from applying to jobs because of jargon. And a 2017 UK study took a whole big group of job ads from different companies and asked younger workers to rate their accessibility. half of the ads they were looking at were determined to be unclear and that there was difficulty interpreting what the jobs were for. This made the candidates feel intimidated and not good enough to apply, and therefore they just didn't. Jargon in job ads is pretty easy to identify as well, in terms of things that could be just internal to your company and not actually being used out in the industry or out in the market. But there's another factor to this, which is gender bias. And could language used in your job postings be the reason that your company might be struggling to reach gender parity? Wording really matters, especially masculine wording. As a Harvard study found, job ads that contained more masculine wording led to women making a series of assumptions. And before I go through this, I will tell you, masculine wording are things like we're looking for an aggressive go-getter who is relentless in their pursuit of XYZ, somebody that is a rock star. These are some masculine terms that could be putting women off. But the assumptions that women would make is that A, there were more men already working there. B, they wouldn't belong in that position. And therefore, the job was less appealing to them. Interestingly, while the masculine wording discouraged women from applying, um, women still believed that they were able to perform the job. And so, to quote the study's authors, subtle language differences in how jobs are advertised may help explain the ongoing gender gap in historically male-dominated fields. So it's just something to consider when you're going through your job ads. If you want to take a look at how you're describing the person that you're hoping will come into that role. Is there something you might be able to change to reduce that that might be discouraging women from applying? And the flip side is true for men as well. If there's words like nurturing or something along those lines, it could be discouraging men from applying because it might be too feminine. Language is a really interesting piece that we've seen have a big difference in this space. So the next thing is intersectionality. I know I'm going to bring it back to this, but I'm not going to talk about it too much because we already have. But people often can and often do fall into more than one marginalized group. You can be a gay disabled person. You can be a gay disabled person of color. And even if somebody doesn't fall into more than one group, recognizing the resulting overlap in marginalized individuals and groups is really important to any comprehensive push against workplace prejudice. And of course, all of these come with biases, and it's important to understand the way that unconscious bias can affect the way you hire. If you find out someone is a part of one group first, you might form an opinion about what they are capable of, what their life experiences are like. If you then find out that they might be in another marginalized group, it can change your unconscious bias. It can bring more in, and it can maybe affect the way that you are thinking about hiring them, affect the way that you're speaking to them. And so the way that we try to give the advice here is, and it can be hard, especially if there's certain goals that your company has, but not pushing just one group of marginalized people, because that can leave others out. If one person is part of more than one marginalized group and you're making a major push in this one direction, maybe just for women, it can be leaving out women that fall into other marginalized groups as well. And so I do encourage a holistic view and understanding how the overlaps work in this situation and how a conversation to make sure that everyone is included can help in the long run. So this is an interesting one, and it's very topical right now in terms of workplaces and workspaces. As we have shifted, us in Sydney, I think a lot of us are working from home in terms of workplaces and workspaces. So it indeed, at the moment, right before this lockdown kicked off, our office has been opened back up in May. We had a new system in place where you had to book a desk to come in, and that can create a challenge for people who rely on routine or who thrive on routine, and changes to their routine can throw them off a little bit. It's really important to consider the accessibility and needs of employees instead of waiting for someone to put up their hand and say that they have an issue and maybe singling them out. What could some things be in your office spaces that, if you changed things to be a little more accessible, could end up helping everyone in the long run? And that's the way that we kind of look at it at Indeed, is to try to make it so that if something is accessible to one person, it might have a positive impact on all. Things that can make a big difference to people as well as lighting and noise around them or lack thereof. That can sometimes affect their places of how they work. And I think it's important to create a safe space, especially in the candidate journey or in your in the beginning stage of the interview, to ask people or to make it safe for them to come out and tell you what their workplaces and spaces, their ideal workplace and space is, and what does that look like for them to thrive. And so that's one of my recommendations here, is to ensure that you're making that conversation a safe place where they don't feel like if they tell you that, for example, myself, I am a one-handed typer and I type very fast with one hand, but I need to use a different keyboard than my laptop because of the way that I type. And so I need to make sure that I feel comfortable saying to someone, if I tell someone that I need an accommodation for typing, they're not going to think, well, she can't do the job. Or, oh, maybe she doesn't type as fast and that could affect her workload. Something along those lines, to make sure that you are making those accommodations when you are interviewing, even at the interview stage, and when someone starts. Allyship is so important. Allyship can help establish trust and safety for your employees to feel empowered. It can help in stigma that already may exist. It can help you share and educate some of your employees on the experiences that others have had, and it can encourage them to become involved. One thing we say about our inclusion resource groups, and the one thing that we owe it when we talk about them in our meetings, or if we have new people coming into our company and we want to explain what they are, we always start by saying, you do not need to be somebody that falls into any of these groups to join. In fact, we encourage you to join if you don't fall into one of these groups, to learn more about what life is like for those people in your teams, people that you're working with. And allyship is important for listening to the voice of diverse employees from different backgrounds. One of the biggest mistakes that is made is putting the responsibility on the employees to tell the employer what they need and what needs to happen or where they could improve. The employer should really be making the effort themselves to ensure that there is allyship within their company, if possible, when possible. And that is where we can also talk about culture fit versus culture add. I know one of the most common terms in the recruitment space is screening out, when you screen out candidates. But often you can change that mindset to be screen in and look at what someone can culturally add to your company in terms of how they could add new experiences, new perspectives to what you might not have already. And that's what our SVP, Human Resources, calls cultural addition. And that's a great mindset to think about in terms of, if this person might not look like a cultural fit on paper, what could they potentially bring to you that could expand your culture within your workspace? And finally, my favorite is to create an employee resource group, a business resource group. You don't have to have a huge budget or a huge amount of time. It's something where you can start small. What are you passionate about? What area of diversity and inclusion are you passionate about? And are there people in your company that might be passionate about it as well? It's great to do some research and assess what company needs this employee resource group could potentially address. And then it's great to go to your senior leadership and talk to them about it and to get them on board, while at the same time putting it out there to your senior leadership that you might want someone to help you sponsor, because you are looking to solve or looking to achieve X amount of goals that you think could better help the company. Even if it's just knowledge and education sharing, that's a great goal to start with. And finally, promoting your ERG internally. How can you do that? Maybe you get your executive sponsor to help you with that, so that the rest of the company or the middle management or the employees see that they have the go ahead from the senior leadership. Those are some really quick tips. I'll be on one of the tables to talk about this later as well. And so those were some of my recommendations. We're going to talk about this a lot more today, but here is the QR code for the DI&B report. If you'd like to go ahead and scan that code, we'll also share the link after this for you to click if you're on a desktop to download that. as well. And so I'll give it one more second. And in that one more second, Andrea, I think I'm handing back to you. So thank you, everyone, for joining and listening to me today. I hope you found that helpful, and I'm looking forward to discussing this.
So we've had a couple of questions in the group. And I'm actually going to ask Sally McKibben to come and join me up on stage as well, to talk about these fabulous groups that you have. Hi, Sally. Sally's also in Indeed. So Sophie Saba was asking about the groups and whether you run events, and Sally's already put in the chat that you do run events. But there was the next part of it about, do you monitor the outputs, or do you monitor it to ensure that you are still you're getting improvements, or that the groups are delivering what they want?
That's a very good question.
And you may not have the answer to it.
I do. We definitely have goals for the groups every year, and each group that is set up in Australia has different goals that they're all working towards. So, for example, I'm part of Women at Indeed. We would have specific things that we're trying to challenge people to learn. Allyship is one of those things as well. We were trying to make it inclusive for men to be involved. So there definitely are. The challenge with trying to monitor your progress is that can be up to the individual. So we definitely host events. Last year, we did an event with a panel of 3 women that worked at Indeed, talking about their careers and how things have changed in the workforce, but we still have a long way to go. We ran another event on male allyship and the importance of that in a workplace, and how they need to be the champions of change. And I think that across any of our diversity and inclusion groups that we belong to, the allyship part is a really important part. But yes, sometimes that stuff's hard to measure. We get people along to these events, but how do you know if you've actually changed somebody's thought process in that process? So we're actually now doing a lot of work this year with how can we upskill our members, not just the broader business, but can we do something for these people who actually want to make a difference? And then can we then monitor how that changes maybe how they behave or what they can share within their teams, and look at a more targeted approach this year is something we're thinking about.
So, and just going back, Lucas McInnes made a great point about the 73% about being comfortable at work. How many of that 73% were non-diverse workers? And I wonder who think that people are treated equally rather than the experience these people are having. And we do hear it a lot with the hashtags of Black All Lives Matter and not all men. And, you know, we do know in the world that people have.
Do you know that when International Women's Day is coming up, the biggest search on Google is there International Men's Day?
Yes, exactly.
You know, it's very
like my son asking when is Children's Day, and every day is Children's Day, but
there is an International Men's Day.
But there is. Women are perhaps just better at getting organised to promote it a bit more. Who knows? So how do we know then that Australian workers in Australia do feel comfortable with their true selves at work?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it has to come from constant checking, you know, are we actually asking these hard questions as from a management perspective? You know, it doesn't always have to be a gigantic sweeping study, but are managers of teams asking their teams, are they feeling comfortable? Is there any metrics coming from higher where people have to stay on top of this? I think it's a discussion that shouldn't happen once a year or once when someone feels like it. But, you know, someone is probably not going to put their hand up and say, I'm feeling uncomfortable being my authentic self at work. It's going to have to be, it's a tough conversation, but it's one that I think the more it happens, the more you find out where the areas are that need improvement. And that's where you can start to maybe hopefully enact some change to make people feel, to help encourage people to be more authentic at work, to make sure that they know that, you know, if they show up as their authentic self, whatever that looks like, they're not going to face any ramifications for that in terms of self-expression or anything. And it would take a pretty big effort, I think. But I think once it got going, once the ball got rolling, I think it would be beneficial for the whole company going forward, as it would become a more commonplace conversation that people became comfortable with.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to ask Corey, if he's still on the call, if he can join us. Corey from People Scout. I've had another question here, and earlier this year they did a brilliant presentation for us on Indigenous recruitment. Now, one of the questions we've had is from Danny Fried, who has said, we know that some groups, particularly people with disability and Indigenous people, have learned from past discrimination not to apply for targeted roles. How do we then undertake targeted recruitment processes while avoiding the stigma? Am I putting you on the spot? While you think about that, Corey, let me just say I've seen a lot of posts on LinkedIn where people with a disability are saying things like remote work, and particularly for people like introverts as well. This idea of remote work is opening up a lot more opportunities to them because they don't have to be in an office that accommodates a disability. It's easier for them. They don't have to get to an office and those sorts of things. But, you know, how are we recruiting when there has been this sort of discrimination in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's an ongoing piece of work that everyone is continuing to work with. And this is where especially within the First Nations people and Indigenous people, we're working with the communities to know how to leverage that and how to go to market and how to work with them. With a couple of so we obviously run RPOs, and some of you may have seen the Lend-Lease First Nation piece that we did around the RAP program. A lot of our clients have RAP programs, and we're heavily involved with those and working with those around how we go to market, especially with targeted roles, but also how the process looks and feels for those people to come on board as well. So a lot of our clients now, we have a First Nations person within the recruitment process, whether that be interviewing, being involved in their first day or their first 90 days, in sort of immersing them into the business so they feel comfortable with the whole process. So I think the way you mentioned the targeting, it is still a tough piece of work, and we have to be very careful around that. And with some of and being Lend-Lease, I think Jane spoke around that they're asking for several different ways that they can do that, and waiting to hear back from different groups around what's allowed and what can be done. So yeah, really tough, but we work with them and work with them.
And we have got your presentation shared in our tribe under the topic of diversity, I think. So for those of you that are tribe members, you can go and see what People Scout have done to recruit Indigenous people. And Danny's come back and said, no, they don't apply for non-targeted roles. We still have to go out probably and actively seek out people with a disability. And just as a little aside, and you'll hear more about it in the coming months, we, through last year's pandemic at Talent Table, ran Jobs for Australia, counselling people who'd lost their jobs through COVID. We are joining up with an international movement called Jobs for Humanity. And all of you as TA professionals are allowed to volunteer 2 to 4 hours of time to help us. And we are actually going to be targeting, to start with, the refugees, blind people or disabled people, and there's one other that escapes me if anyone from my Jobs for Humanity leadership team is on here. put it in the comments, and we're going to be launching that by October, and you will all be asked if you'd like to come and volunteer. And we're going to work with companies, helping them find people from these groups to actively join their organisations. And you give us the jobs and we try and fill them from our cohort of people. And we're partnering with a number of groups to do that. Sally, I'm going to send you off, and Corey, I'm going to send you off, and I'm going to ask Jen, thank you both. I'm going to ask Jen to come up because I've had another question. Jen, Jen Quirk is from N Border, and she's joining us all the way from Canada today. It's about 9 o'clock at night for her. She still looks so glamorous. N Border, of course, you would know, is an onboarding platform. Now, Sophie Saba from CSL has asked about whether Indeed conduct pre-employment medical assessments for new starters for the purpose of providing support to people that need it. And Sally's come back and said you don't. I've said I haven't done a medical since I was 19 in 1984, but I do know some organisations do. Jen, as part of an onboarding process, how do we ensure that we are perhaps meeting the needs of a diverse workforce when they join us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I was a little bit stumped on, whether you would ask for medical information during onboarding. I don't know if that's always appropriate, but I think just a simple way is having some sort of get to know you survey for the new hire to fill out before they join. And you can ask certain questions, especially if it is relevant to their ability to perform the job. Those can be submitted anonymously, or they can be tied to that individual. But we really like to encourage those, about you surveys and give those new hires an opportunity to submit, any kind of special needs or requests that they have. And even aside from that, make it fun as well. Ask the important questions, but also ask them questions like, what's your guilty pleasure TV show that you love to watch? Or, when 3 p.m. rolls around, what's your go-to snack or munchie that you enjoy? And then we love to see our customers sharing those results with the rest of the team. And it just gives the team and the new hires something to chat about and find those commonalities between each other come their first day.
Yeah, it's a fabulous platform. And my guilty pleasure is I'm up to season 12 of Criminal Minds. It's taken me months.
Great show.
Didn't know there were so many psychopaths in the world, but there you go. Okay, so I don't think that I have any more questions. People have put a couple of comments up about doing medicals and things. So what I'm going to do now, folks, is turn the presentation off. On your tables, you've each got a table name under there. And under your tables, we'd like you to sort of discuss something around those topics. Some of the tables have some hosts from our sponsors. And I didn't find out if Ben or Chloe were on from Noble Agency. And sorry, they were a bit busy today and couldn't make it. But what I'll do also is move around and give you a couple of talking points. And Erin, you feel free to move around as well. So Jen, I'll send you back to your table. I'm going to turn the presentation off and we'll turn it back on just before 12:30. And if you can put comments into the chat group, it'd be good to know what some of the points are that you're covering, and we can sort of see if we can't get answers and stuff to that as we go forward. Before we do, of course, I would like to thank Erin very much for her presentation. Some great stats there. We will put the link to the survey information in a follow-up email, along with other resources that our sponsors have given us and other things that we think that you might be interested in as well. But let's get back to our groups and network. And remember, if you want to switch tables, you can. You work out the etiquette. You just double-click an empty chair and join that table. So thank you for now, and I will join you on the floor.